Hello and welcome back to Social Distancing. Apologies for the slight break in the videos. On Good Friday I had been recording a video but then had to abandon it for technical reasons. And then unfortunately last week I was ill with what I suspect was coronavirus. Thankfully only very mild symptoms, but the symptoms were there and I wasn't able to make a video last week. I am feeling much better now and back to more or less normal. This video will still be a little shorter than previous ones because I'm still sort of getting back on top of everything and so on, but it's good to be back and recording again. As before, we're going to be working through a hymn together. I'm not recording any warm-up exercises for this one, but I do encourage you to warm up your voice before you sing, and you can go back to my previous videos and have a look at some suggestions for how you might do that. For now though, we're going to move straight on to the hymn that we're looking at today, which is Oh for a Closer Walk with God. So the reason I've chosen this hymn is because it relates very well to the Gospel reading for this Sunday, which is the encounter on the road to Emmaus. If you're not familiar with the story, this happens shortly after Jesus' resurrection, and a couple of his followers are travelling to a place called Emmaus near Jerusalem, and Jesus appears to them, but they don't know it's him. They're prevented from recognising him. So they're walking along, and Jesus asks them what they've been talking about as they've been walking, and he asks them why they're looking sad and why they're downcast. And they explain to him that Jesus of Nazareth is dead, has been crucified. They believed in him, they believed he was a prophet and the Messiah, but the chief priests and the Pharisees have put him to death. Jesus, of course, the whole while is walking right next to them. Eventually they come to the place they've been travelling to, and they persuade Jesus to come in and rest with them, and they share bread together. And at that point they recognise him, and then he disappears. The story obviously can teach us several things, but I think one of them, and one of the most important, is the idea that Jesus always walks alongside with us. Even when we don't know he's there or we're not looking for him, he's always there and he's always listening. He lets the disciples tell him everything that's on their mind, despite the fact that he already knows it, and in fact knows more than they do. He walks along with them patiently and listens and only sort of says his bit at the very end of the story, and only makes himself known through the breaking of bread, which is symbolic of lots of things, but among them nourishment and dependence. The Lord's Prayer contains the line, "Give us today our daily bread," not stockpile for us a month's supply of bread. Jesus makes himself known in this story through a symbol of the need to depend on him for constant encouragement, energy, and sustenance. This hymn, I think, acknowledges these lessons, but also encourages us to make the conscious decision to walk alongside with God, not just to have him there even though we're not looking for him or we might not recognise him, but to be always looking to acknowledge his presence and to share in that experience with him. So in terms of how the rest of this video is going to be structured, first of all, you've been hearing the tune in the background as I've been talking. Now I'm going to sing through the melody of the first verse, and then I'm going to sing through the harmony parts using verse 2 and layering up, as I've done in previous videos, from the bass parts, then the tenor parts, then the alto parts. And you can listen to those as many times over as you like to learn the notes for each of those parts. I'm then just going to give some brief general direction about how we approach the singing of this hymn, and then we'll sing it together at the very end. Oh, for a closer walk with God, come and have me frame, a light to shine upon the road that leads me to How sweet their memory still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet their memories still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet their memories still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. So there are a few just sort of general points that I want to make about the singing of this hymn, and the first is how we think about the text. Now, the structure of the text is essentially the same in each verse, in that there's a comma or punctuation mark at the end of the first and the second line, but there isn't one at the end of the third line. And that's going to be reflected in the way we sing it, because we're going to break at the end of the first line of each verse, break at the end of the second line, but then I'd like to try going through the third line and the fourth line in one phrase, one breath. When we take a breath at the end of a phrase, we're going to turn the minim at the end of the phrase into a crotchet and have a crotchet rest after it and breathe during that rest. Although in verse 5 the structure is still the same, we'll breathe at the end of the third line even though there isn't punctuation there. Do that in the same way that we do the breaks at the ends of the first and the second line, and that will ensure that as we come towards the end of the hymn, we might want to slow down a bit, we might want to just hold on to that last chord a little bit longer, and breathing at the end of the third line will make sure that we have the breath to sustain that right to the end. But in the other verses, in order to take those last two lines in a single breath, we'll need to keep the tempo fairly brisk. And it can feel a bit too brisk if we think too much about the crotchets as being the sort of main beat or the main pulse through the hymn. If we're going at a fairly brisk speed, then that can start to feel quite heavy and aggressive if each crotchet is very heavily emphasized. So what we need to try and do to keep the tempo going, but also to keep a nice sort of gentle, relaxed feel to the hymn, is think very much in terms of a minim beat and feel nice and gentle on the crotchets that come off the minim beat. And that helps us as well just to shape the text a bit more, to keep making sense of it. Oh, for a closer walk with God. So the beat is very much there on every other note, essentially, as we're moving through those crotchets. But then you also get the sense of it keeping going and keeping moving forward. And that will help, as I say, to make sure that the third and fourth lines can be done together in a single breath. There's also a couple of points I want to make about diction and pronunciation, and I'm just taking the second verse as an example. In the third line we have, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. Now, if we're trying to sing very legato and keep a nice sustained sound going through, what we often do is fall into the trap of joining up two words where the second word starts with a vowel. So in this case we'd get, but they have left an aching void, and it sounds almost like one word because we don't have the consonants to make sense of the gap between the two words. What we need to try and do here is keep the sort of neutral vowel that happens naturally after such consonants as N. You get the just at the end there, N. And we need to keep that in order to make sure that we separate the two words. The sound can still be legato, there can still not be a break in the sound, but we need to differentiate between the two words. So it will sound more like this. But they have left an aching void, an aching void. So there's no gap in the sound there, but there is a gap between the two words, and it makes much more sense. It's a very common trap to fall into, as I say, and it happens all over the place. No matter what language you're singing in, you will often hear Gloria in instead of Gloria in, or even worse, Gloria rin with an extra R in there, which is just terrible. It happens again in verse 4 with the word idol. The dearest idol, stidle, not a word. The dearest idol I have known. Try not to make a gap, but try and separate the two words. Use the time of the neutral vowel after the consonant to just create a little bit of separation, but still sustaining the sound as a whole. The dearest idol I have known. It can be very subtle, but it is an important distinction, I feel, to make there. Otherwise, just a few extra points about how we're going to sing through the hymn as a whole. Verses 1 and 5 are going to be in unison with the middle 3 verses in harmony. The gap between verses, we're going to have the final chord of the verse as 2 minim beats, then a minim beat rest, and then straight into the following verse. So for example, between verses 1 and 2, that will be that leads me to the Lamb of what peaceful hours, and so on. The playover will be an entire verse, because it's quite a short tune, so we'll have the entire verse played over just on the piano before we come in with verse 1. And so now, of course, we come to sing through the hymn as a whole. Please do join in, sing along. Here it is.
To shine upon the road that leads me to the Lamb. What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet the memory still, but they have left an aching void the world can never fill. Return, O holy dove, return, sweet messenger of rest. I hate the sins that made thee mourn and drove thee from my breast. The dearest idol I have known, whatever that idol be, help me to tear it from thy throne and worship only thee. So shall my walk be close with God, calm and serene my frame, so pure a light shall mark the road that leads me to the
Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please share it with anyone else who might enjoy it. You can subscribe either via YouTube or via my website to get email notifications when I post a new video. I'm really pleased at the extent to which people are keeping going with activities of communal music making as best as they can during this period. For me, it's such an important way of sort of engaging and connecting with other people. And I'm just so glad that despite how weird the whole situation is and the lockdown being extended and so on, technology means that we can still do things in some capacity. Even if it's not quite the same, we've got a lot to be thankful for. There's absolutely tons of resources out there. If you've come across any that you think are particularly good or work particularly well for you, post them in comments below. And then other people can sort of see them and we can just sort of build what we're doing a little bit more and engage with more and more people. All being well, I'll be back with a new video next week, probably slightly longer, slightly more in keeping with what I've been doing with the first few videos. Until then, do look after yourselves, and I hope to see you again very soon. Cheers.